Madrid, spring of 1834. The air inside the palace was thick with a strange scent, incense-damp old fabric, and somewhere faint but unmistakable, the smell of a body recently departed. The old doctor, his hands trembling, walked slowly down the marble corridor. He was no stranger to death. Throughout his long service to the Bourbon court, he had witnessed quiet deaths, violent deaths, and deaths that had to be kept hidden. But never had a death made him feel revolted like this one, because this time he wasn't here to perform an autopsy. He was here to preserve. The king was dead. Ferdinand VII, the most hated, the most mocked, and at the same time blindly worshipped monarch of a nation that no longer had any real choices. Now his body lay still on a silk-draped bed surrounded by heavy walls soaked in the colour of mourning. But oddly enough, it wasn't the lifeless face that made the doctor shiver. It was what lay beneath the sheet draped across the king's hips. The thing Ferdinand had spent his life hiding, and yet it was one of the worst-kept secrets in all of Europe. A gift, or more accurately, a curse sent by nature to the wrong man. Too large, too long, too deformed, too much like a cruel joke from the gods. And now, under the silent eyes of courtiers and clergy, the old doctor bowed his head and prepared to perform the preservation ritual of the most wretched legacy in the Spanish royal family, the penis of King Ferdinand VII. Not because anyone wanted to keep it as a relic, but because in the final moments of a decaying dynasty, they all understood this body wasn't just a corpse. It was evidence of collapse. Some dynasties fall to war, others to bad reforms, corruption, or foreign invaders. But Ferdinand's it collapsed because of Ferdinand himself, because of a body he could not control, because of a mind crushed by personal shame, and because of a country too exhausted to speak the truth aloud. In documents banned from publication for nearly 2 centuries, Ferdinand VII is remembered not just as a tyrant. He was the perfect embodiment of royal tragedy, born to rule yet incapable of ruling even himself, raised on silence and lies, and then weaponizing them to strangle an entire nation. Ferdinand was a king, but Ferdinand was also a victim. A child born from incest, raised under a cloud of ridicule, and turned into a nightmare that lasted more than 40 years. And now we turn back time to the year 1784, when a red-faced infant was born in the palace of El Escorial, a child who would grow into the symbol of decline, a man who would drive 3 women to mental breakdowns, a monarch who would unravel an entire country simply because he could never face the truth about himself. This story isn't easy to hear, but it deserves to be told. Because history sometimes doesn't need heroes. It only needs us to have the courage to look at what's too grotesque for anyone else to remember. In the portrait-lined halls of Spanish palaces, the faces of nobles stare back with drooping lips, shovel-like chins, bulging foreheads, and eyes that seem forever trapped in a dreamlike stupor. Once this was called noble beauty. But the truth is simpler and far more terrifying. It was the face of inbreeding. For over 3 centuries, the ruling families of Europe, especially the Habsburgs and the Bourbons, interwove themselves through marriages that required no love, no diversity, and certainly no genetic distance. They married cousins. They married nieces. They married their own aunts. These unions weren't meant to produce children. They were meant to tighten the noose of power around their own necks. And then at some point the genes struck back. On October 14, 1784, in the palace of El Escorial, a child was born amid the chiming of church bells and the whispered prayers of Queen Maria Louisa. Joy filled the air. A new prince, a seed to extend the Bourbon glory. But the angel they were expecting looked like no angel in the Bible. Ferdinand, son of King Charles IV, and Queen Maria Louisa was the perfect consequence of generations of legalized incest under the crown. His parents were first cousins. So were his grandparents. The pure royal blood once revered was in fact a stagnant pool riddled with mutations and genetic instability. Ferdinand carried it in every cell, every fold of his skin, and most disastrously of all, in the most private part of his body. No one knows exactly when things began to seem different, but perhaps it was during his first baths, when the royal wet nurse removed his diaper and couldn't hide her alarm. The child had a genital organ that was too large, too long, and too grotesque by any standard, not just in size, but in form. Strange lumps twisted curvature, a disturbing asymmetry. Royal physicians could do nothing but exchange uneasy glances. They dared not speak, but they began to take notes. In the Vatican, home to some of Europe's most forbidden archives, there remain ancient medical records that describe Prince Ferdinand's penis in chilling detail. Thin as wax at the base, as large as a fist at the tip, and so long it could serve as a walking cane. Some called it dragon syndrome, a poetic euphemism to avoid the truth. This was a rare, complex malformation, never before documented in any medical text of the time. But the true horror wasn't the shape, it was the awareness. Ferdinand grew up in a world of mirrors and glances. From a young age, he sensed that something about how others looked at him was wrong. Servants giggled behind his back, tutors avoided anatomy lessons, visiting princesses kept a strange distance whenever near him. Over time, Ferdinand understood. His secret wasn't a secret. The entire palace knew. All of Spain knew. And worse, they whispered, they chuckled, they mocked, but no one said a word. In classical Greek aesthetics, big was not beautiful. On the contrary, a nobleman's body was expected to be symmetrical, lean, refined, not crude. Apollo did not have a 14-inch penis. Roman emperors didn't need biological weapons to rule the world. But Ferdinand was a deformity, and so shame turned into rage, rage turned into obsession, and obsession into power. He learned to weaponize his status. A servant walked in at the wrong time, banished. A soldier caught a glimpse of the forbidden, exiled. A lady-in-waiting whispered behind his back. Her family was erased from the court's payroll. Ferdinand gradually discovered one terrifying truth: he could do anything as long as he was king. And if God had cursed him with a body no one dared to look at, then he would build a reign no one dared to criticize. Ferdinand's childhood had no friends. His mother, Maria Luisa, was lost in passionate affairs with Prime Minister Manuel de Godoy. His father, Charles IV, was little more than a hunter in royal garb, more interested in birds and game than in his own son. Ferdinand grew up alone, carrying two traumas: the contempt of his mother and the hatred of himself. He watched his parents share lovers, heard laughter behind closed doors, and he made a vow: one day there will be silence. One day all will bow to me. But behind that vow was a child desperate to hide the thing he was most ashamed of by controlling everything he could see. As he aged, Ferdinand's deformities became harder to ignore. His body grew strangely sunken, chest uneven legs, easily bruised skin, erratic moods. His penis, unlike most, did not stop growing. It continued to twist, to lengthen, to morph into something parasitic and grotesque. Modern medicine suspects he suffered from a rare hormonal disorder. But at the time, everything was wrapped in superstition, and Ferdinand, with nowhere else to turn, began seeking out charlatans, miracle doctors, magical potions, rhino horn powders, pearl elixirs, dragon's blood, virgin's urine. He became the devoted client of every quack on the Iberian Peninsula. But nothing changed the truth: he could not love a woman the way other men did. And in that tragedy, Ferdinand made a decision: if his body could not conquer, then his power would. He dreamed of the throne as a kind of cure. If he were king, he would never have to feel ashamed. If he were king, he'd never have to explain. If he were king, he'd hold an entire country in his hands, and no one would dare ask him a thing about his body. But power does not heal. It amplifies, and Ferdinand didn't realize that the very crown he craved would turn his physical deformity into political monstrosity, a deformity that would drive 3 women mad before they died, fracture an empire, and lead Spain into wars not guided by ideals, but by one man's deep-rooted physiological shame. So, before Ferdinand ever married, Before he ever wore the crown, before he silenced the last smile in the Bourbon Palace, everything was already set in motion. Not by destiny, but by DNA. Not by enemies, but by centuries of incestuous kisses. Not by political schemes, but by a body born wrong and no one brave enough to make it right. Madrid, October 1802. Church bells rang in jubilant harmony. The royal choir sang the traditional Bourbon wedding hymn. Beneath the grand dome of Almudena Cathedral, thousands gathered to witness the marriage of Prince Ferdinand of Spain and Princess Maria Antonia of Naples and Sicily, a 16-year-old bride dressed in a white gown trimmed with gold, her wide, innocent eyes filled with hope for a glorious future. The crowd cheered. Priests offered blessings. All of Europe sent wedding gifts. And no one knew that that very night in the heart of the royal palace, a legal rape conducted under medical supervision with custom-made pillows, lubricants, opium and tears would mark the beginning of a tragedy that would haunt an entire reign. Maria Antonia came from a strictly conservative household. She had been taught to dance to read the Bible and to smile gently when someone kissed her hand. As for matrimonial duties, all she knew was God will guide you. And then Ferdinand entered her life, handsome in a stiff, uncomfortable way, polite, but as if rehearsed. He danced in time, but his eyes always darted away. She thought he was just shy. She didn't know Ferdinand wasn't shy. Ferdinand was afraid. On their wedding night, they were not alone. 3 maids, a guard, 2 doctors, and a full set of instruments were already stationed in the bedroom. A U-shaped pillow stuffed with cotton and leather oil extracted from African snakeskin liquid opium for drinking and anointing, and a handwritten instruction sheet from the prince's personal physician. As the maids carefully placed the strange pillow in the center of the bed, Maria Antonia felt a chill creep down her spine. But there was no time to ask. She had been told, "You don't need to understand, only obey." Ferdinand entered, undressed, and her world shattered. One servant would later recall years afterward that the Queen's scream that night sounded like someone being burned alive. "Monster, stay away from me, monster." She backed into a corner, her trembling hand pointing at her husband's body, as if she had just seen Satan in human form. Ferdinand stood frozen, not from humiliation, but because he was used to it. He had seen that look dozens of times from doctors, priests, servants. That look that didn't see a man, but a deformity, a defective object. And now, that same look had appeared in the eyes of his wife, the one person who was supposed to accept him. From that first night on, they were never husband and wife. They were executioner and victim. That intercourse wasn't a romantic ritual. It was a medical procedure. Doctors waited just outside the door for signals. The instruments were brought out one by one. Maria Antonia was given opium, her hands gently tied with silk ribbons, her body oiled and positioned in ways meant to minimize damage. Even so, she fainted midway through. Then came the blood. A lot of blood. And tears. From both of them. In the months that followed, Ferdinand lived in the silent chill of a wife who never looked him in the eye. Maria Antonia moved through the palace like a ghost, speaking to no one, smiling, only in the presence of priests. She began using opium every night, not to feel joy, but simply to sleep without dreaming. And then she became pregnant. The news sparked hope. Maybe things weren't so bad. Maybe Ferdinand wasn't a curse. Maybe this child would be their salvation. But in the 4th month, Maria Antonia miscarried. Doctors called it a biological incident. But those who knew the truth understood no body can sustain life if it's damaged every time it tries to create it. Ferdinand fell apart in a twisted way. He didn't comfort her, didn't grieve, didn't cry. Instead, he accused. He believed Maria Antonia had shaken herself on purpose after intercourse, that she had prayed for God to take the child, that she hated him so deeply the child didn't want to live. She didn't respond. She just stayed silent, took her medicine, and endured. A few months later, she was pregnant again. This time, Ferdinand summoned astrologers from France, mystics from Portugal, and even an Eastern healer to help protect the child's spirit. Maria Antonia was confined to bed for 3 straight weeks, fed potions made from seahorse blood, and crushed poppy seeds mixed with honey. She was no longer a woman. She was a royal incubator. And then in the 8th month, the baby died inside her. Blood poured out in the middle of the night. She was rushed away in silence. This time, she was no longer a princess. She was a breathing corpse. She stopped speaking, stopped eating properly, stopped sleeping, stopped singing, stopped attending mass. She wouldn't bathe unless forced. And every time she heard Ferdinand's footsteps, her body recoiled as if expecting torture. In 1807, at the age of 21, Maria Antonia died. Her death certificate listed frail health, but everyone knew the truth: she died from being raped in spirit too many times, treated like a hatching machine, exploited by a husband both pitiful and cruel. There was no grand funeral, no heartfelt eulogy, just a death quickly replaced by plans to find a new wife. Ferdinand did not cry. He looked at her corpse and, according to a priest's account, whispered, "We have failed. Not I. You." Soon after, several maids were dismissed. The Queen's apothecary, the man who had prepared her opium for years, was found dead in his room, a letter clenched in his mouth. Rumour had it the note contained a secret the king didn't want known. The letter disappeared. The death was ruled an accident. Ferdinand began to transform, not just mentally, but physically. His face grew colder. His eyes became vacant. He was no longer the wounded prince. He was a paranoid ruler with power and a reason to punish the world. He kept the pillow used with his first wife, locked it in a wooden chest, hung a death mask of Maria Antonia in a private room, and from that moment on began searching for a second wife, not to love, but to breed. Because for Ferdinand, love had died on their very first wedding night. In most normal dynasties, sex was a private matter. For kings, it could be a means of reproduction, a source of pleasure, or a sacred privilege of the ruling class. But in Spain, under Ferdinand VII, sex was a political catastrophe, a lingering crisis like a fever no one dared to name. A mad tangle of desire for children, obsession with power, shame over bodily deformities, and a desperate struggle to force fate to give a man what God himself had refused. Ferdinand remarried less than a year after the death of Maria Antonia. His new bride, Maria Isabel of Portugal, was just 19, young, polite, and completely unaware of what had happened in the royal bedchamber before her. Or if she had heard anything, it had been sugared silken and wrapped in the moral righteousness of royal gossip. A happy marriage, they said. A death from an old illness. A fragile girl. And a prince who simply needed a new wife to carry on the sacred mission of the dynasty. Maria Isabel had no idea she was stepping into a trap, laid with velvet pillows and gold-embroidered silk, but lined underneath with cold steel opium and a brutal silence. The wedding night took place in a room prepared more like a laboratory than a bedroom. Special pillows, lubricants, opium, doctors standing just outside the door. Everything calculated, like a surgery, not a consummation. And Ferdinand, wearing the dull expression of a man long acquainted with failure, walked in as if he believed in nothing but protocol. No one recorded the screams of that night, but maids later said the Queen didn't speak for 3 days. She just sat and stared at a fixed invisible point on the wall. Eyes open, lips dry, hands faintly trembling. A doctor was called. Sedatives were prescribed. A priest was brought in to read the Bible aloud. Maria Isabel nodded, but heard none of it. She heard nothing at all. In the months that followed, Ferdinand continued his mission to produce an heir with methodical sessions each carefully documented. The physicians had notebooks, the astrologers had star charts. The young wife had sunken eyes and a voice that grew quieter each day like a caged bird losing breath. She became pregnant after a few months and the court exhaled. This time would be different. This time, hope returned. but the fetus died in the womb during the 4th month. Maria Isabel nearly died with it. No one dared say it aloud. A heavy gloom settled over the palace. Ferdinand fell silent for days, not out of grief but confusion. He didn't understand. There had been medicine, lunar calendars, herbal oils, protective charms. Why had it failed? And like many men who cannot confront themselves, he blamed others. Sometimes the doctors, sometimes poison in the food, sometimes a French conspiracy. But in the end, as before, he turned on the woman beside him. It was her weakness, her lack of faith, her failure to fulfill her role as queen. Maria Isabel became pregnant again. This time Ferdinand escalated everything: charms under the pillow, incense from the East, medicine from North Africa, holy water from the Vatican, prayers in ancient Latin. The queen was forbidden from walking too much, from crying, from laughing too hard, from thinking dark thoughts. But in the 8th month she went into premature labor. The baby died. She lost too much blood and never regained consciousness. Ferdinand didn't leave her room for 4 days, not to mourn, but to issue orders. Burn all the linens, all the oils, the cushions, the herbs. Everything had to be replaced, all failures erased. Then he married again. Maria Josefa Amalia, his 3rd wife, came from Saxony. She was no romantic. She had studied medicine, brought her own physician, carried her own notebook, her own pills, even her own journal to document life as the wife of Spain's most peculiar king. She approached the marriage like a living experiment. Ferdinand found that pleasing. No more romantic pretense, no empty promises. They met like 2 patients trying to save a child that had never existed. They followed a strict schedule. Doctors checked pulses, daily reports were made, urine samples analyzed, menstrual cycles compared to lunar phases. Ferdinand called it his royal optimization phase. For a brief moment, it seemed everything was under control. Maria Josefa became pregnant. The court sighed in relief. Ferdinand smiled, a rare occurrence. But as if fate had issued a final curse, the fetus died before the 7th month. Maria Josefa, exhausted, hopeless, and perhaps ashamed, never recovered. She died not long after, leaving behind a journal sealed by Ferdinand himself, and a void no medicine could fill. By now, Ferdinand was no longer a man. He was a failed project, a body under punishment, a king incapable of doing the one basic thing a throne demanded, leaving his blood on it. He began to believe in the supernatural, invisible conspiracies, foreign agents sending cursed women to make him barren. He hired more mystics, summoned more astrologers. The palace basement grew new rooms, sent laboratories, prayer chambers, and a hidden space where he whispered nightly prayers no one dared to overhear. Sex was no longer about legacy. It had become a national disease. Each time a queen became pregnant, the country lit candles in collective prayer. Each miscarriage was a silent day of mourning, unspoken, unnamed. The entire nation was trapped inside Ferdinand's bedroom, held hostage by what should have been the most private part of a man's life. But Ferdinand was no longer a man, at least not in the ordinary sense. He was a political revenant kept alive by the illusion that trying one more time would change everything. But nothing changed. Only women fading one by one, and an empire slipping further each day into the dark. While Ferdinand VII wrestled on his royal bed, struggling through bouts of intercourse filled with medical instruments, scented oils and trembling prayers, an entire empire was dissolving piece by piece across the ocean, not with the roar of cannons, but with the quiet indifference of a man who could no longer hear the groans of his own country. Spain entered the 19th century like a grieving widow, the scent of old glory still clinging to her mourning veil, but her reality rotten, decayed, and beyond repair. Once master of the seas, ruling from the Iberian Peninsula to the Andes, the Amazon and Manila, the kingdom had been reduced to tear-stained maps, defiant colonies, and a crumbling throne surrounded by incense, masking the stench of death. In 1810, the first gunfire of rebellion echoed in the Americas. Caracas declared independence. Then Argentina, Chile, Mexico, Colombia. One by one, lands, nations, and indigenous bloodlines rose up. They no longer called the king their father. They called him the sterile monster rotting in Madrid. In revolutionary pamphlets, Ferdinand was mocked not only for his cruelty, but also for his impotence. No children, no heirs, no future. How could he represent a nation pregnant with the hope of independence? In the Americas, he became a symbol of a decrepit Europe rotting in its own blood. In Madrid, Ferdinand heard none of it, refused to hear, feared to hear. The only sound he listened to was the pounding of his own heart every time the Queen's period was late, and the hopeless sighs of physicians whenever another fetus slipped from the womb too soon. He called it a divine mission, the continuation of the Bourbon bloodline. But really, it was the last excuse he had to believe he mattered. Not because he was king, but because he could still try, even if he always failed, even if his wife's blood soaked through the royal bedsheets. The Escorial Palace was no longer a place of light. It became a silent labyrinth where every breath was recorded, every footstep tracked. Obsessed with betrayal, Ferdinand built secret tunnels to move unseen, installed one-way mirrors in the bedrooms, planted spies in the kitchens, the cleaning staff, the stables. No one knew who worked for whom. Everyone whispered. Everyone was afraid. And when fear rules, one wrong word is enough to vanish. Absolute power in the hands of a man drowning in sexual inadequacy became a paranoid hallucination. Ferdinand believed there were forces trying to make him infertile, that the queens were being poisoned, that his doctors were spies, that his servants were stealing his hair for witchcraft. He withdrew from human contact. Every time he left his room, he demanded everyone turn their backs. No one could look him in the eye without permission. Meanwhile, the price of wheat tripled. Children died of hunger in the streets. Officers at the front lines were abandoned. No pay, no bullets. People in Madrid whispered about the king with the longest cock and the shortest brain. Anonymous pamphlets showed giant crowned penises captioned, "Spain is ruled by the wrong head." But the generals, the priests, the nobility, they stayed silent. Not out of loyalty, but out of fear. Fear of a cold glance, a whispered order of execution, a nighttime disappearance with no explanation. Because Ferdinand didn't just hold power, he wielded the fear of everyone around him as a weapon. Parliament was dissolved. The Constitution of 1812, a rare, precious glimmer of Spanish liberty after Napoleon was torn to shreds. Ferdinand declared himself king by the grace of God, and according to him, God never made mistakes. If the country collapsed, it was because the people lacked faith. If the Queen miscarried, it was God's test. If millions starved, it was divine purification. In the royal library, Ferdinand ordered the removal of every book about the French Revolution. In schools, he banned the teaching of American geography because America no longer belongs to Spain, so it's not worth remembering. In churches, he issued decrees asking the faithful to pray for the king's fertility. Once in a meeting with his top officials, while an entire continent burned with revolution, Ferdinand laid his hand gently on the table and asked, "If a child is born at the end of the year, what name should we give it?" No one answered. Heads lowered, lips sealed. It wasn't a question. It was a threat dressed in the velvet of royal power. Spain had become a rudderless ship, and the man holding the rudder was too busy wondering if the rudder itself was cursed. No strategy, no policy, only superstition, power, and fear organized into a system. Domestic uprisings were crushed with an iron hand. Poor provinces were bled dry with taxes to fund prayer rooms and royal fertility programs. Rumors even spread that Ferdinand once requested the placenta of a maid to be cooked into a potion to increase his vital essence. The nation was no longer a unified body. It was a collection of festering wounds. But to Ferdinand, it was all just noise. The only sound that mattered was the heartbeat of a child that never came. And in the palace, when night fell, when the servants had gone to bed, when the doctors had filed their reports, Ferdinand sat alone, turning over a handkerchief, scented with lavender once used by a former wife. He didn't cry. He didn't sigh. He simply stared, as if trying to summon something he once had or once thought he had. A chance, a son, a living heir bearing the Bourbon name. But there was nothing, only thick, suffocating silence, and an empire dissolving drop by drop into the dark, like the shame a royal court had spent nearly 30 years trying to bury. 3 wives were dead. Empty wombs, cold beds bleedings, that brought no life, only deepened the bottomless pit in Ferdinand's mind. The entire Spanish Bourbon dynasty now dangled by a single thread. A man stood at the head of an empire, and also at the end of his bloodline. A king with no children, no heir, no way to protect his own throne except to keep sowing seeds into barren earth. And then in that moment, she walked in. Maria Cristina of the Two Sicilies. A long name, thick with lineage, and like every woman who had entered Ferdinand's life, cloaked in a necessary gentleness. But beneath the pale skin and delicate fan, there was something else. Something no woman had ever dared carry into the Bourbon palace before a pregnancy. Maria Cristina arrived in Madrid in 1829. The diplomatic letters, the court ceremonies, the negotiations all unfolded as if she were a blank slate, a new queen untouched by flesh or deception. But everyone knew. The maids whispered. The officials averted their eyes. The rumours were oddly specific. She had a lover before the marriage. That the child she carried could not possibly be Ferdinand's, a man whose previous 3 wives had never carried a child beyond a few months, a man whom doctors discreetly labelled mechanically infertile. And yet no one spoke. No investigation. No accusations. No reckoning. Perhaps Ferdinand knew. Perhaps he didn't. Or worse, perhaps he knew and chose to believe anyway. Because for the first time in 30 years of failure, he saw a belly swell by the day, without screams, without blood, without trauma. For the first time he saw a wife who did not collapse in the great hall, who did not tremble through the night, who did not write desperate diary entries or whisper to a crucifix hidden in her nightgown. For the first time, he saw hope. In 1830, the child was born. A girl. Her name was Isabella. Not the boy the court had hoped for, but something real tangible, a screaming infant in a palace of stone-cold silence. And Ferdinand, with a soft but iron move, stood before the court and church and declared, "This is my daughter." No one dared object, because Ferdinand was no longer someone you could argue with. In his mind, reality was not shaped by truth, but by belief, his belief. A twisted but absolute kind of truth that made dissent disappear from politics in an instant. He didn't need DNA. He didn't need proof. He only needed that belief to rescue him from the abyss of infertility he had spent a lifetime trying to climb out of. Maria Cristina, the woman who dared deceive a king, was now the Queen Mother of Spain, holding the most precious piece on the Bourbon chessboard, a child the king had claimed. She was clever, knew when to stay silent, knew when to cry just enough, and smile just barely. She never brought up the past, never let pity show in her eyes, but Ferdinand, though he tried to believe, was never at peace. She might have been pregnant before. The child might not carry Bourbon blood. God might be testing him one last time. And that might, though never spoken, ate away at his mind night after night. After Isabella's birth, Ferdinand became obsessed with having another child. One more, one he could be sure was his. One who would be the final redemption. He demanded Maria Cristina continue the sacred duty. But this time, it wasn't the tender scheduled copulations. It was violent, desperate attempts, as if he could crush her womb into producing a son by force. Doctors grew fearful. Handmaids avoided the room. Maria Cristina began to shrink inward like a chestnut shell, smooth, cold, impenetrable. She was no longer a wife, but the keeper of the monarchy's darkest secret. In her hands lay a truth that, if spoken, could collapse the dynasty. Ferdinand began to spiral into full-blown paranoia. He believed someone was trying to steal Isabella from him, that the Pope was scheming to place another child on the throne, that even Maria Cristina was plotting to dethrone his daughter and raise another house to power. He had spies planted in his wife's bedchamber. He reopened old Inquisition tunnels for surveillance. And whenever someone asked about Isabella's health, he shot back, "Why do you want to know who sent you?" His mental state plummeted. Some nights he wandered the palace clutching the old pillow of his first wife, murmuring names no one recognized. At times he screamed at his own reflection in the mirror. At others, he ordered blood transfusions from young soldiers, believing fresh blood would restore his manhood. Physicians were helpless. Priests were terrified. Healers kept their distance. No one wanted to be the last person standing when Ferdinand finally cracked. By 1833, his body gave way. Not from illness, but from a fear that never ended. He wouldn't eat unless food was tasted first. Wouldn't sleep without 2 guards at his bedside. And wouldn't let anyone, even Maria Cristina, touch Isabella without his direct permission. He died on a damp September day in a room filled with the smell of old wood and camphor. No one knows what he thought in his final moment. Only that when Maria Cristina entered, he didn't turn. Just closed his eyes, took his daughter's hand, and let go. Lightly, like a man releasing the lie he had held onto all his life. Isabella II ascended the throne, but the Bourbon dynasty never stood firm again. Ferdinand VII, the last man to cling to a throne with warped seed and silent deceit, was gone. But he left behind a daughter no one dared question the paternity of a queen. No one dared call truly royal, and a dynasty no one quite believed in anymore. When a man lives too long in humiliation, without being allowed to acknowledge it, he begins to turn the entire world into a cage, one that no one may enter, but from which no one may escape. Ferdinand VII was not simply a paranoid king. He was the final product of a weary empire, where madness was no longer a misfortune but policy. After 3 failed marriages, dozens of miscarriages, and countless children lost before they could even be named, Ferdinand entered his 50s like a rigid, prickly shadow of a man. But the most striking transformation was not in his body, it was in his eyes. They said that if you looked into Ferdinand's eyes after 1830, you wouldn't see life but pure suspicion, a substance thick like pine resin, clinging to anyone who dared come close. He wouldn't speak more than 3 sentences to anyone unless a third person was present. He wouldn't eat anything unless it had been tested 3 times by 3 different cooks. He wouldn't sleep longer than an hour without a guard standing at the head of his bedsword, in hand eyes wide open. Maria Cristina, his final wife, the one he honoured with the task of bearing Isabella, at first believed she had earned his trust. But she quickly realised that being the mother of the heir also meant becoming the primary surveillance target within the palace. Ferdinand didn't trust his wife, or rather he had never truly trusted anyone. He believed in her necessity, but that belief resembled the trust one places in a blood reserve, not a person. Every time Maria Cristina took a walk, 2 women accompanied her. 2 men monitored the women, and a third observer watched from a distance through a telescope. All were instructed not to breathe too loudly. If the Queen happened to turn back and catch one of her watchers looking away, that person would disappear the next day. The palace had become a spy machine. Ferdinand rebuilt the old tunnel system from the days of the Inquisition, connecting rooms through secret passageways so he could observe without being seen. He installed one-way mirrors in the hallways, not for decoration, but for surveillance. In the Queen's bedroom, at least 3 holes were drilled into the ceiling, each linked to a listening tube running to the basement. A team of 6 was tasked with transcribing every whispered conversation between the Queen and her maids. Each morning, the transcripts were delivered to Ferdinand's desk alongside the breakfast menu and weather report. And Maria Cristina, the once strong woman who had dared to deceive the throne to protect an illegitimate child, began to rot, not by knife, but by silence. No one spoke to her. No one responded. She didn't know which of the 3 servants she trusted was reporting on her. She didn't know who switched her spoon. She lived under the eyes of those who kept their heads bowed, but she knew one of them always looked up when she wasn't watching. She stopped writing letters, stopped whispering, stopped sleeping deeply, stopped believing, and in doing so, she survived. Ferdinand, meanwhile, slowly transformed himself into an institution of control. He was no longer a man with feelings, but a living sensor network. Every breath in the palace reached him. Every footstep echoed in his skull. And each time Maria Cristina sneezed, 3 people were summoned: a physician, a priest, and a tarot reader. He installed mirrors in the bathroom. He ordered guards to time how long the Queen urinated. One day he asked: yesterday, she peed twice. Today, 3 times. Why not? Because he needed an answer. But because he needed everyone to understand nothing was beyond his sight. Nothing. The court, already brittle, now drowned in a fear as dense as steam in a windowless bathroom. People spoke less, laughed softer. When they passed each other in the hallway, they nodded like wax figures. Meetings became silent performances. Ministers read reports in monotone voices, avoiding all adjectives. No one wanted to risk Ferdinand thinking they were saying more than necessary. Someone smiled as the Queen entered a room reassigned to mucking stables in Aragon. A maid dropped a mirror, vanished. A doctor suggested the Queen should get more rest, accused of inciting rebellion, sent to an asylum. Silence reigned, a collective hush where the only acceptable language was unconditional obedience. Ferdinand didn't need to order many executions. He didn't have to. A few well-timed deaths were enough. The rest knew how to stay quiet. Like a prison, the Escorial Palace was layered in control. The top floor belonged to the royal family, the middle for officials, the bottom for servants. The basement, where Ferdinand spent much of his final years, was the surveillance center. It was no coincidence that the place he felt most at ease was the darkest. There he kept movement maps of the palace, daily dialogue logs of key figures, and a small bed beside his array of listening tubes. They said he once slept there for 2 straight weeks, just to monitor whether Maria Cristina had any intention to betray him. But betrayal in Ferdinand's mind didn't need to happen. The possibility alone warranted punishment. During a rare illness, when the 3-year-old Isabella II had a fever, Ferdinand flew into a rage. He believed someone had tried to poison her. 3 people were arrested, including a nurse who had cared for Isabella since birth. No one ever saw her again. Maria Cristina didn't dare ask. Even a mother in Ferdinand's palace had to choose silence to keep the one child she still had. By the end of his life, Ferdinand trusted no one. Not doctors, not priests, not his wife, not his child, not even himself. He began recording his own voice to check if anyone was impersonating him. Each day, he wrote a new code for himself to verify he still controlled his own mind. During one severe illness, when doctors suggested a blood transfusion, he demanded a 3-generation lineage check of the donor. When no one was found sufficiently pure, he refused treatment. He wasn't afraid of dying. He was afraid of someone injecting ideas into his blood. When Ferdinand finally collapsed, not from disease, but because his body could no longer resist the rot of his own mind, no one was certain he had truly died. Some said he only pretended to see who would rejoice. Some said he left behind instructions to continue spying on the Queen after his death. Some said he ordered his genitals removed, preserved in honey, and sent to the Vatican to protect the nation. Whatever the truth, when he closed his eyes, so too did an entire dynasty. The Escorial Palace was cleansed afterward. The mirrors were taken down. The tunnels sealed. The transcripts burned. But the smell of fear didn't leave. It seeped into the walls, into the curtains, into the floor tiles. And every footstep afterward, every echo in the halls, every hurried glance away, still carried the shadow of the man who turned his kingdom into a prison of his own making. Death for most people is a release. But for Ferdinand VII, it never came at the right time. In the final years of his life, he didn't live. He lingered, a ghost haunting the threshold of his own body. Surrounded by custom pillows, soundproofed walls, and a retinue of mute and tight-lipped servants, Ferdinand moved like a man guarding a corpse, his own terrified that if he let his guard down for even a single night, his body would rise and strip the mask off the monarchy itself. They say Ferdinand died 3 times before he actually died. The first was in 1832, when he collapsed in the bathroom during a seizure. The doctors brought him back, but his eyes never did. They became someone else's eyes, that had glimpsed the space between awareness and delirium and no longer wished to return. The second time was when he saw Isabella, his only daughter, smile at a young soldier in the courtyard. A harmless smile from a 3-year-old girl. But to him, it was a blade driven into his gut. He ordered the soldier transferred to Galicia and locked Isabella in her room for a week, not as punishment, but to see if solitude could erase that unnecessary emotion. "No one may smile unless I allow it," he said. And the court understood even the unintentional smile of a child could shake the throne. The third time came the night he picked up a knife. Not to end his life, but to cut into it. The doctors only found out after he passed out from blood loss. They were stunned to see beneath the linen a body slashed down the midsection, not deep but enough to leave ragged scars from groin to waist. Ferdinand had tried to carve himself apart, a desperate attempt to fix what nature had engraved too deeply into his flesh. No one asked why. No one dared. The only record in the royal medical log read, "Self-inflicted trauma to genital tissue with sharp object." Unsuccessful. But success was never the point, because what Ferdinand destroyed that night wasn't just a part of his body, it was the last fragment of his humanity, the part that still believed he was a man, a person, a king. When he truly died in September 1833, there was no thunder, no rain, no omens, no signs. Just a quiet room, a final breath like a fading wisp of smoke, and a heartbeat slipping quietly into darkness. Maria Cristina stood beside him. She didn't cry. She simply held his hand as if bidding farewell to a nightmare that had overstayed its welcome in her bed. But Ferdinand did not leave this world neatly like other men. Moments after his final breath, a special team of royal physicians was summoned not to confirm the death, but to handle the body under state-level secrecy. And in the early hours after his heart stopped, his corpse was placed on a wooden table, not to be cleaned, not to be dressed for burial, but to be dissected. The autopsy of Ferdinand VII was conducted under the direct supervision of the royal court and representatives of the Holy See. The official purpose was never disclosed, but everyone understood. They weren't interested in whether his heart had stopped, or the condition of his lungs or liver. All focus was fixed on a single point between his legs. And there, the rumours were confirmed. What had once been whispers and stories passed between generations of nurses became undeniable truth. A genital organ, nearly 14 inches long, grotesquely curved, like a lightning-scorched olive branch covered in nodular growths, fatty tissue protrusions and surgical stitches from prior self-inflicted corrections. No one spoke. Some looked away. Someone dropped a pen. The chief medical officer wrote only one line in the dissection report: abnormal development of male genitalia, rare significant impact on physical and mental function. Nothing more. But behind that sterile sentence was a truth everyone felt, but no one dared to voice. This body was not just a corpse. It was evidence, living proof of a dynasty ruled by pain, impotence, and fear. The next day, Ferdinand was embalmed. But not all of him went into the coffin. His genitals, preserved in a special solution, were separated and placed in a black lacquered wooden box, sealed with the royal crest, and sent to the Vatican in a journey no one would ever officially acknowledge. A secret wrapped in the thickest layers of European power. It's rumoured that the specimen still resides in a Vatican archive, buried deep within the Holy See, stored beside the most sensitive documents and artifacts never meant to see the light of day. Some say it's labelled Specimen 43, do not open without papal authority. Others believe that because of its existence, the Vatican never fully recognised Isabella as the legitimate heir. But wherever it lies, it is no longer the penis of a man. It is the physical memory of a political wound, the flesh-bound embodiment of a genetic defect weaponized into power, the final leftover of an empire that once sought to conquer the world, and was ultimately defeated not by gunfire, but by its own flesh. Ferdinand VII is dead, but his legacy is not. It lives in the silences of history, in censored records, in the faces of the women who entered the Bourbon Palace, and never walked out the same. And if history had a body, Ferdinand would be the part it always tries to cover with the fragile cloth of civilization. Ferdinand VII is dead, but what he left behind did not rest in his coffin. It crept through the marble halls of the Escorial Palace, etched itself into sealed medical reports, clung to the bloodline of his successor, and remains forever engraved in the nation's memory, an ugly stain no dynasty since has dared to scrub clean in public. Because Ferdinand was not merely a king with physical deformities and a troubled mind. He was the living embodiment of a system long since rotten, a place where power went unquestioned, where bloodlines mattered more than competence, and where private shame could become a death sentence for an entire nation. For over 40 years he did not rule, he hovered like a leaden cloud over Spain. Every wife who failed to bear a child extended the curse of decline by another century. Every royal bedroom, turned into a sexual laboratory, was another tear in the monarchy's fabric that no one dared stitch back. And every decree he whispered through the haze of paranoia pushed the country one step closer to the abyss. No wars, no coups. Just a king who couldn't tell the difference between his own fears and the fears of his people, and ruled them both as if they were one and the same. Isabella II succeeded him in whispers. People congratulated her but wouldn't look her in the eye, because no one could say for certain whose daughter was she really. And that uncertainty from the very first day she sat on the throne became the final verdict on a failed dynasty, a king who left behind nothing but doubt. Isabella never had a real chance. She inherited a throne no one believed in, a kingdom hollowed out, a historical wound stitched shut with a political smile. The wars, the uprisings, the dethronements and restorations, they all began the moment Ferdinand nodded and said, "This is my child." But the most painful question in this story is not what was wrong with Ferdinand. It's why was someone like Ferdinand ever allowed to be king? The answer lies in the very DNA of the empire that produced him. A dynasty that trusted lineage more than logic. A system where cousin marriages were essential. Where medicine was forbidden from saying anything that might offend divine authority. Where no one dared point out what was wrong for fear of being branded a heretic. Ferdinand wasn't a catastrophe. He was an inevitability. He was a distorted mirror reflecting every absurdity that hereditary monarchy had ever planted. And when the light finally hit that mirror, people saw the truth. No one wanted to face that power if left unrestrained. Not only corrupts the ruler, it silences a nation so thoroughly that it accepts being ruled by someone who cannot even rule himself. Ferdinand is dead, but in truth, he never really left. He's still there in the locked archives, in some glass jar in the Vatican, in the eyes of politicians too afraid to speak truth, and in ourselves each time history repeats, not because it must, but because we were too afraid to learn from it.